This is the woman I have chosen for you.
Mom, what are you saying?
A man needs a strong home. One wife is not enough for your future.
I am still your wife.
Please let me sit with you.
Don't sit near me.
But why? We need to talk.
There's nothing to talk about.
Why are you doing this to me?
Leave me alone!
For 5 long and quiet years, Daniel and his wife, Grace, lived together in their big and beautiful house in Lagos, surrounded by comfort and everything they needed. But deep inside Grace's heart, there was a heavy sadness that never went away because every day she woke up and went to sleep without a child to hold. And no matter how much she tried to smile and stay strong for her husband, the pain of waiting and hoping kept growing inside her like a silent storm. In another place, far from their home, Mama Daniel sat alone thinking about her son's life, and her heart became filled with anger and disappointment as she kept counting the years and wondering why Grace had not given her a grandchild. And instead of showing patience or kindness, she allowed her thoughts to turn into pressure, believing strongly that her son deserved a better future than what she was seeing. One afternoon, without calling or sending any message, Mama Daniel arrived at Daniel and Grace's house, and when Grace opened the door and greeted her with respect and a gentle smile, she could already feel a strange tension in the air, as if something heavy had followed her mother-in-law into the house, bringing with it worry, fear, and trouble. As they stood inside the living room, Mama Daniel spoke strong and painful words to her son Daniel, telling him that 5 years without a child was too long, and that a marriage without children had no meaning. And even though Grace stood quietly and said nothing, each word felt like a sharp pain in her chest, cutting deeper than anything she had ever felt before. That night, when the house became quiet and everyone had gone to sleep, Grace went down on her knees beside her bed, and with tears slowly falling from her eyes, she lifted her hands and spoke softly to God, asking Him to remember her, to show her mercy, and to bless her with even just one child, because she felt tired of the silence and the shame that followed her everywhere. While Grace was praying with a broken but hopeful heart, Mama Daniel went to meet a spiritual man in secret, and with a serious face, she explained her desire to change her son's life, not knowing or not caring that the path she was choosing was dark, dangerous, and filled with consequences that would soon begin to affect everyone. After that night, something slowly began to change inside Daniel, and even though he could not explain it, his heart started becoming distant and cold toward Grace, and the same love he once showed her began to fade, little by little, leaving Grace confused and wondering what she had done wrong. Even as Daniel changed and the love in their home began to grow weak, Grace did not give up, and night after night, she continued to pray with tears in her eyes, holding on to her faith and believing that no matter how dark things looked, God would one day answer her and turn her pain into joy. Then, one quiet night, when everything seemed normal, Grace suddenly felt something different in her body, and as she tried to understand what was happening, her heart began to beat fast, and when the truth finally became clear to her, tears filled her eyes again. But this time, they were tears of surprise, joy, and deep gratitude, because she knew that God had finally remembered her. The next morning, with a trembling voice and a heart full of mixed emotions, Grace told Daniel that she was pregnant. And even though there was still confusion and distance between them, that moment brought a small light into their home, a light of hope that quietly began to grow, promising that their story was not over yet, After finally hearing the good news that she was pregnant, Grace felt a deep joy in her heart and believed that her pain was over. But as she looked at her husband Daniel, she noticed that his smile was weak and his eyes were distant. And even though a new life was growing inside her, the happiness she expected in their home began to feel heavy and uncertain. Not long after, Mama Daniel returned to their house with a strong and proud look on her face. And as she stepped inside without warmth, Grace could feel that her presence had brought tension again, while Daniel stood confused, not knowing what his mother had planned this time. With no care for Grace's feelings, Mama Daniel introduced another young woman as the one she had chosen for her son to marry. And as Grace stood there, holding her stomach in shock, Daniel's silence made the moment even more painful, as if the joy of her pregnancy no longer mattered. As the days passed, something strange began to happen to Daniel, because his thoughts became confused and his heart slowly turned away from Grace. And without understanding that a dark spiritual plan was working against him, he began to feel controlled by something he could not see. One morning, when Grace prepared food with love and care for her husband, Daniel looked at her with cold eyes and refused to eat. And in that quiet moment, Grace felt her heart sink deeply as she realized that the man she loved was slowly becoming a stranger. As Mama Daniel sat proudly beside the new woman she had brought, the house that was once filled with love became divided. And while Grace stood quietly holding her pregnancy with pain in her eyes, it became clear that there was no longer peace in the home. Each day, Daniel's heart grew colder and his love for Grace faded more. And even though he sometimes looked confused inside, the strange influence over him made him push his wife away and feel closer to the woman his mother had chosen. As her pregnancy grew, Grace began to feel more alone than ever, because even though she carried her husband's child, she no longer had his care, his words, or his love. And every night, she sat quietly, holding her stomach and wondering why her joy had turned into pain. One evening, when Daniel spoke coldly and asked Grace to stay away from him, something inside her heart broke deeply, because in that moment, she understood that the love they once shared was no longer there, and she was now alone in a house that no longer felt like home. That night, as rain fell outside and the house remained silent, Grace knelt down again to pray with tears in her eyes, asking God to protect her and her unborn child, because even though she had received the miracle she prayed for, her joy was now under attack and surrounded by pain. As time passed, Daniel's heart became completely closed toward his wife Grace, and even though she spoke to him gently and tried to show love, he no longer responded with kindness, and the warmth that once filled their home slowly disappeared, leaving Grace feeling like she was living with a stranger. When Grace tried to talk about their marriage and how she felt, Daniel spoke harshly and without care, and his words cut deeply into her heart, making her feel unloved, unwanted, and alone, even though she was still carrying his child. As Grace tried one more time to be close to her husband, Daniel pushed her away, both in words and in actions. And in that painful moment, Grace realized that the man she once loved had completely turned against her. Soon after, Daniel stopped coming home and refused to answer Grace's calls. And as she sat alone in the big house holding her stomach, she began to understand that she had been left to face everything by herself. Early one morning, while the house was silent and empty, Grace suddenly felt strong pain in her body. And as she held her stomach and cried out, she realized that her time to give birth had come, but there was no one there to help her. With tears in her eyes and pain growing stronger, Grace struggled to move through the house, calling for help that never came. And in that moment, the home that once felt safe became a place of loneliness and fear. Just when it seemed like all hope was gone, The gateman saw Grace in pain and quickly helped her by calling a cab. And even though they were strangers, they became the help she needed at her most difficult moment. At the hospital, after a long and painful struggle, Grace gave birth to 2 baby boys. And as she heard their cries for the first time, her heart filled with relief and joy, even though the father, Daniel, was nowhere to be found. As Grace lay in the hospital bed holding her newborn sons, she kept looking at the door, hoping to see Daniel. But no one from her home came to visit her, and the silence around her made her feel forgotten and alone. Just when Grace thought she had no one left, her best friend came to the hospital with love and care. And in that moment, Grace realized that even in her darkest time, she was not completely alone. After leaving the hospital, instead of returning to the beautiful home she once shared with Daniel, Grace found herself standing in front of an unfinished building with her twin boys, knowing that her life had changed completely. That night, as rain fell through the broken roof, Grace held her babies close and prayed softly, knowing that even though her heart was broken and her life was hard, she was still alive and she still had hope. After everything fell apart, Grace was now living in an unfinished building with her twin baby boys, and as she looked at the broken walls and empty space around her, she remembered her past life in luxury and felt like everything had been taken away from her. As days passed, Grace struggled to feed her twin babies because she had very little food and no help. And each time her children cried from hunger, her heart broke even more as she tried her best to survive. Even in her suffering, Grace never stopped praying, and in the middle of the cold, dark nights, she lifted her hands to God with tears, asking Him to protect her children and give her strength to continue. As Grace prayed more deeply, something unseen began to happen in the spiritual world, and a strange feeling of power and movement filled the air around her, even though she did not fully understand it. At the same time, Mama Daniel began to feel fear and confusion in her own home because the peace she once had was now gone, and she could sense that something powerful was coming against her plans. As Grace continued to pray with all her strength, her tears turned into bold prayers, and her voice became stronger as she cried out to God for justice, protection, and deliverance for her children. Slowly, Mama Daniel began to lose her strength and confidence, and the things she once controlled started falling apart, making her realize that she was no longer in charge of the situation. One night, Grace lifted her voice to heaven with all her pain and strength, crying out to God with tears, asking Him to see her suffering and remember her and her children. After her powerful prayer, a great storm came, and in the middle of it, Mama Daniel's plans completely failed as fear and shock filled her home, showing that something greater than human power was now at work. When the storm finally ended, everything became quiet again, and Grace sat with her twin babies in peace, feeling that even though life was still hard, something had changed in the atmosphere around her. In that moment of peace after suffering, Grace felt deep inside her heart that her story was not finished, because even though she had been broken, she believed that God was now starting to turn her pain into something new. After the powerful storm that shook the night and changed everything in a single moment, Mama Daniel was found lifeless inside her luxury mansion. And when the news reached Daniel, his world stopped completely because he could not understand how the same home that once looked full of pride, control, and authority had now become a place of silence, fear, and irreversible loss, marking the beginning of a new painful reality for him. That same night, something strange and invisible broke inside Daniel's mind and heart, as if a heavy darkness that had been controlling his thoughts for a long time suddenly disappeared, And for the first time in many months, he woke up feeling clear, confused, and free, as though his eyes were finally opening to see everything he had been doing without understanding it. As Daniel slowly sat up and began to remember the things he had done to Grace, his heart became heavy with deep pain and regret, because every memory of her tears, her silence, her suffering, and her loneliness came back to him at once. And in that moment, he finally realized that the woman who once loved him with all her heart had been broken by his own actions. Overwhelmed by guilt and sorrow, Daniel fell to his knees inside his empty house, crying deeply as he held his head in his hands, wishing he could turn back time and undo every mistake he had made, but understanding that no amount of tears could easily repair the damage that had already been done to Grace and their family. With tears still falling from his eyes and pain pressing heavily on his chest, Daniel stood up with determination and began searching everywhere for Grace and his twin children, walking through streets, asking questions, and refusing to give up, because, for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to lose everything important in his life. During his desperate search, Daniel arrived at the home of Grace's best friend, and with a broken voice and tired eyes, he begged for information about his wife and children, hoping that even a small clue could lead him to the family he had lost because of his mistakes. At first, Grace's best friend refused to trust Daniel because of everything he had done, but after seeing the genuine pain, regret, and tears in his eyes, she slowly softened and finally told him the painful truth about Grace's suffering, her struggles during pregnancy, and the difficult life she was now living with the twins. Without wasting any more time, Daniel immediately left and began a long emotional journey across the city, filled with fear, hope, and regret as he searched every place he could think of, praying silently that he would not be too late to find Grace and his children. After a long and painful search, Daniel finally saw Grace from a distance, living inside an unfinished building with their twin boys. And in that quiet moment, his heart broke completely as he realized how far their lives had fallen from the beautiful home they once shared. When Daniel finally stepped into the unfinished building, there was a long silence as Grace looked at him with deep pain, sadness, and emotional distance. And in that moment, both of them felt the weight of everything that had happened between them standing heavily in the air. With tears in her eyes, Grace finally spoke openly to Daniel, telling him how she suffered alone during pregnancy, how she gave birth without him, and how deeply his absence and rejection had broken her heart, leaving scars that were not easy to forget. As Daniel slowly looked at his twin sons for the first time, his heart trembled with emotion, because he saw parts of himself in them and realized how many important moments he had missed. And with shaking hands, he tried to reach out to them with hope and love. Standing before Grace, Daniel begged for forgiveness, with tears and a broken voice, asking for another chance to be a better husband and father. But Grace looked at him carefully, because she knew that healing from deep pain takes time, and trust cannot return in one moment. In that powerful and emotional moment, Grace looked at her children, then at Daniel, and with a heart filled with both pain and strength, she decided that their future would not simply return to the past, but would slowly be rebuilt step by step, showing that their story could either become full restoration or remain broken, depending on the choices they now make together. As the soft sunlight filled the unfinished building, and Daniel, Grace, and the twin boys stood together quietly. There was no perfect happiness yet, but there was hope, because even after everything they had gone through, they were still alive, still connected, and still given a chance to rebuild what was once destroyed. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, Make sure to subscribe to African Folktale by Zoya for more beautiful and meaningful tales. Don't forget to like, share, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.